This was posted by Velocity Visual over on Daily Kos, who apparently copied it from someplace else. So I don't know the provenance of this, or, with the origin of it, but it's just brilliant. And it's just a quick reminder, just in case you forgot how wonderful the 4 years of the Trump presidency was. So let's just go through it very quickly, huh? President Trump incited an insurrection against the government. He mismanaged a pandemic that killed nearly 500,000 Americans. He separated children from their families. He lost those children in the bureaucracy. He tear-gassed peaceful protesters on Lafayette Square so he could hold a photo op holding a Bible in front of a church. He tried to block all Muslims from entering the country. He got impeached. Then he got impeached again. He had the worst jobs record of any president in modern history. He pressured Ukraine to dig dirt on Joe Biden. He fired the FBI director for investigating his ties to Russia. He bragged about firing the FBI director on television. He took Vladimir Putin's word over the U.S. intelligence community. He diverted military funding from military families, to build his wall. He caused the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. He called Black Lives Matter a symbol of hate. He lied over 30,000 times. He banned transgender people from serving in the military. He ejected reporters from the White House briefing room when they asked tough questions. He vetoed the defense funding bill because it renamed military bases named for Confederate soldiers. He refused to release his tax returns. He increased the national debt by nearly $8 trillion. He had 3 of the highest annual trade deficits in American history. He called veterans and soldiers who died in combat losers and suckers. He coddled the leader of Saudi Arabia after he ordered the execution and dismembering of an American-based journalist. He refused to concede the 2020 election he lost. He hired his unqualified daughter and son-in-law to work in the White House. He walked out of an interview with Leslie Stahl. He called neo-Nazis very fine people. He suggested the people who inject bleach into their bodies should inject bleach to fight COVID. He abandoned our allies, the Kurds, to Turkey. He pushed through massive tax cuts for the wealthiest, but balked at any help for average Americans. He incited anti-lockdown protesters in several states at the height of the pandemic. He withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accords. He withdrew the U.S. from the Iranian nuclear deal. He withdrew the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was designed to block China's advances. He insulted his own cabinet members on Twitter. He pushed the leader of Montenegro out of the way during a photo op. He failed to reiterate the U.S. commitment to defending NATO allies. He called Haiti and African nations S-hole countries. He called the city of Baltimore the worst in the nation. He claimed that he single-handedly brought back the phrase Merry Christmas, even though it hadn't gone anywhere. He forced his cabinet members to praise him publicly like some cult leader. He believed he should be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He berated and belittled his hand-picked attorney general when he recused himself from the Russia probe. He suggested the U.S. should buy Greenland. He colluded with Mitch McConnell to push through federal judges and 2 Supreme Court justices after supporting efforts to prevent his predecessor from appointing judges. He repeatedly called media the enemies of the people, echoing Joseph Stalin. He claimed that if we tested fewer people for COVID, we'd have fewer cases. He violated the Emoluments Clause. He thought that Nambia was a country, He told Bob Woodward in private that coronavirus was a big deal, but then lied about it in public. He called his exceedingly faithful vice president a P-word for following the Constitution. He nearly got us into a war with Iran after threatening them by tweet. He nominated a corrupt head of the EPA. He nominated a corrupt head of HHS. He nominated a corrupt head of the Interior Department. He nominated a corrupt head of the USDA. He praised dictators and authoritarians around the world while criticizing American allies. He refused to allow the presidential transition to begin when he lost the election. He insulted war hero John McCain, even after his death. He spent an obscene amount of time playing golf after criticizing Barack Obama for playing far less golf. He falsely claimed that he won the 2016 popular vote when he lost by 3 million. He called the Muslim mayor of London a stone. He falsely claimed that he turned down being Times Man of the Year. He considered firing special counsel Robert Mueller on several occasions. He mocked wearing face masks to guard against transmitting COVID, leading to hundreds of thousands of deaths. He locked Congress out of its constitutional duty to confirm cabinet members by appointing acting ones. He used a racist dog whistle by calling COVID the China virus. He hired and associated with numerous shady figures that were eventually convicted of federal offenses, including his own campaign manager and his own national security advisor. He pardoned several of his shady associates. He gave the Presidential Medal of Freedom to 2 congressmen who amplified his bat-crazy conspiracy theories. He got into a telephone fight with the leader of Australia. He had a Secretary of State who called him a moron. He forced his press secretary to claim without merit that he had the largest inauguration crowd in history. He botched the COVID vaccine rollout. He tweeted so much dangerous propaganda that Twitter eventually banned him. He charged the Secret Service jacked up rates at his properties. He constantly interrupted Joe Biden in his first presidential debate. He claimed that COVID would magically disappear. He called a U.S. Senator Pocahontas a racist slur. He used his Twitter account to blast Nordstrom when it stopped selling Ivanka's merchandise. He opened up millions of pristine federal lands to development and drilling. He got into a losing tariff war with China that cost U.S. taxpayers to bail out farmers. He claimed that his losing tariff war was a win for the U.S. He ignored or even didn't take part in daily intelligence briefings. He blew off honoring American war dead in France because it was raining. He redesigned Air Force One to look like the Trump shuttle. He got played by Kim Jong-un and his love letters. He threatened to go after social media companies in clear violation of the Constitution. He botched the response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. He threw paper towels at Puerto Ricans when he finally visited them. He pressured the governor and Secretary of State of Georgia to find him votes. He thought that the Virgin Islands had a president. He drew on a map with a Sharpie to justify his inaccurate tweet that Alabama was threatened by a hurricane. He allowed White House staff to use personal email accounts for official business after blasting Hillary Clinton for doing the same thing. He rolled back regulations that protected the public from mercury and asbestos. He pushed regulators to waste time studying snake oil remedies for COVID. He rolled back regulations that stopped coal companies from dumping waste into rivers. He held blatant campaign rallies at the White House in violation of the Hatch Act. He tried to take away millions of Americans' health insurance because the law was named for a black man. He refused to attend his successor's inauguration. He nominated the worst education secretary in history. He threatened judges who wouldn't do what he wanted. He attacked Dr. Anthony Fauci. He promised that Mexico would pay for a wall. It didn't. He allowed political hacks to overrule government scientists on major reports on climate change. He struggled navigating a ramp after claiming his opponent was feeble. He called an African-American congresswoman low IQ. He threatened to withhold federal aid from cities and states with Democratic leaders. He went ahead with rallies filled with maskless supporters in the middle of a pandemic. He claimed that legitimate investigations of his wrongdoing were witch hunts. He seemed to demonstrate a belief that there were airports during the American Revolution. He demanded total loyalty from the FBI director. He praised a conspiracy theory that Democrats are satanic pedophiles. He completely gutted the Voice of America. He placed a political hack in charge of the Postal Service. He claimed without evidence that the Obama administration bugged Trump Tower. He suggested that the U.S. should allow more people from places like Norway into our country. He suggested that COVID wasn't that bad because he recovered with the help of top government doctors and treatments not available to the public. He overturned energy conservation standards that even the industry supported. He reduced the number of refugees the U.S. accepts. He insulted various members of Congress and the media with infantile nicknames. He gave Rush Limbaugh, for God's sake, a Presidential Medal of Freedom at the State of the Union address. He named as head of the federal personnel a 29-year-old who had been previously fired from the White House for allegations of financial improprieties. He eliminated the White House Office of Pandemic Response. He used soldiers as campaign props in violation of the Hatch Act. He fired any advisor who made the mistake of disagreeing with him. He demanded the Pentagon throw him a Soviet-style military parade. He hired a ton of white nationalists. He politicized the civil service. He did absolutely nothing after Russia hacked the U.S. government. He falsely said the Boy Scouts called him to say his bizarre jamboree speech was the best speech ever given to the Scouts. He claimed that black people would overrun the suburbs if Biden won. He insulted reporters of color. He insulted women reporters. He insulted women reporters of color. He suggested that he was fine with China's oppression of 1 million Uyghurs. He attacked the Supreme Court when it ruled against him. He summoned Pennsylvania state legislators to the White House to pressure them to overturn the election. He spent countless hours every day watching Fox News. He refused to allow his administration to comply with congressional subpoenas. He hired Rudy Giuliani as his lawyer. He tried to punish Amazon because the Jeff Bezos-owned Washington Post wrote a negative story about him. He acted as if the Attorney General of the United States was his own personal attorney. He attempted to get the federal government to defend him in a libel lawsuit from a woman who accused him of sexual assault. He held private meetings with Vladimir Putin without staff present. He didn't disclose his private meetings with Vladimir Putin so that the U.S. had to find out via Russia media. He stopped holding press conferences for months at a time. He ordered U.S. companies to leave China even though he has no such power. He led a political party that couldn't even be bothered to draft a policy platform. He claimed preposterously that Article 2 of the Constitution gave him absolute power. He tried to pressure the UK to hold the British Open at his golf course. He suggested that the government could nuke hurricanes. He suggested that wind turbines cause cancer. He said he had a special aptitude for science. He fired the head of election cybersecurity after that man said that the 2020 election was secure. He blurted out classified information to Russian officials. He tried to force the G7 to hold their meeting at his failing golf resort in Florida. He fired the acting attorney general when she refused to go along with his unconstitutional Muslim travel ban. He hired Stephen Miller. He openly discussed national security issues in the dining room at Mar-a-Lago where everyone could hear them. He interfered with plans to relocate the FBI because a new development there might compete with his hotel. He abandoned Iraqi refugees who helped the U.S. during the war. He tried to get Russia back into the G7. He held a COVID super spreader event at the Rose Garden. He seemed to believe that Frederick Douglass is still alive. He lost 60 election fraud cases in court, including before judges he had nominated. He falsely claimed that factories were reopening when they weren't. He shamelessly exploited terror attacks in Europe to justify his anti-immigrant policies. He still hasn't come up with a health care plan, still hasn't come up with an infrastructure plan, forced Secret Service agents to drive him around Walter Reed while contagious with COVID, told the Proud Boys to stand by and stand back, screwed up the census, withdrew the U.S. from the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic. And this is only the beginning of the list.